Our first look at the Flagstaff woman accused of killing her own mother inside a home while police were outside.
There with her, and I wanted someone to go and do something about it, so I told everybody.
She called 911 using her own mother's name. She bought a gun and called it a Mother's Day gift. Then, while police officers were standing right outside the front door, she pulled the trigger. And what investigators would allegedly discover inside that home would raise a question far more disturbing than simply what happened that night. Was this a woman experiencing a genuine mental collapse? Or was a mental collapse being used to explain something that had been planned long before the police ever arrived? If you like true crime stories like this that keep you up at night, and you want to know how it ends, hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the story of an elderly mother who spent her final years living under the same roof as her daughter. A daughter who would allegedly use her name to call 911. A daughter who had purchased a gun just days before. And a daughter who, according to police, would pull the trigger at the exact moment officers were already approaching the house. In the early hours of October 19, 2025, in Flagstaff, Arizona, 87-year-old Doris Brody was still alive. It was still dark outside. Most of the neighborhood was asleep. And inside her own home, Doris may have believed she was safe. After all, home is supposed to be the place where you lower your guard. It is where you sleep, where you keep the people you trust, where, at 87 years old, you hope the worst dangers in life are finally behind you. Doris had lived a long life. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who, according to those who knew her, brought warmth and steadiness to the people around her. But that night, the person inside the house who would allegedly become the greatest threat to her was not a stranger. It was not an intruder. It was not someone breaking through a window. It was her own daughter, 46-year-old Maya Brody. And by the time the sun came up, Doris Brody would be dead. The story begins with screaming. Just after 4 a.m., police received a noise complaint connected to a home on East Terrace Avenue. But this wasn't the kind of complaint people make when a neighbor is simply playing music too loudly. The report involved screaming, disturbing screaming. According to the information that would later emerge, someone described the sounds as so severe that it seemed as though a person might be getting tortured. Think about that for a moment. It is the middle of the night, your neighborhood is quiet, then suddenly you hear screaming coming from nearby. Not laughter, not an argument you can ignore. Screaming that continues long enough and sounds disturbing enough for someone to believe something terrible might be happening. Police were dispatched. Officers headed toward the address. At that point, they had no idea what they were about to walk into. They approached the home in the darkness. Flagstaff nights can be cold, and in the early morning hours, the entire street would have been mostly still. The kind of stillness where every unusual sound becomes impossible to ignore. The officers walked toward the front door, and then it happened. A gunshot. One loud, unmistakable gunshot. It came from inside the house. The officers were right there, close enough to hear it, close enough to know immediately that whatever was happening inside had just escalated into something potentially deadly. The door opened. Standing there was Maya Brody. She was 46 years old, and according to the account of the incident, her demeanor immediately caught attention. Because sometimes, when officers arrive after hearing a gunshot, they expect panic. They expect confusion. They expect someone shouting for help. But police allegedly encountered something different. They asked about the gunshot. Mia confirmed that a gun had been fired. And then, according to investigators, she attempted to close the door, right in front of them. But officers had just heard the gunshot coming from inside. They knew they could not simply walk away. They forced their way into the home. And inside, they found 87-year-old Doris Brody. She had been shot in the head. She was collapsed in the living room. Emergency responders began working on her. For approximately 10 minutes, they attempted to save her life. They performed life-saving measures. They tried to bring her back, but nothing changed the outcome. Doris Brody was pronounced dead at the scene. An 87-year-old woman had been shot and killed inside her own home, and the person police immediately focused on was the woman standing at the door, her daughter. But this case would become far more complicated than a shooting that happened in a single moment. Because as investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to Doris's death, they allegedly discovered something deeply unsettling. Someone had already called 911 earlier that same night. The caller had identified herself as Doris Brody. The caller reported a disturbance. There was screaming. There was concern about what was happening nearby. On the surface, it sounded like an elderly woman calling police, because something frightening was happening in the neighborhood. Except Doris hadn't made the call. According to investigators, the person speaking to the dispatcher had been Maya, her daughter, and she had allegedly used her own mother's name. That detail changes everything. Because if investigators were correct, the 911 call wasn't simply an emergency call. It may have been part of the sequence of events leading up to the shooting. Imagine sitting in the same house as your mother. Your mother is still alive, and you allegedly pick up the phone, contact emergency services, and pretend to be her. Why? What was the purpose? Was Maya trying to bring police to the area? Was she trying to create a record of disturbance and screaming? Was she attempting to establish a story before the shooting occurred? Those questions would become increasingly important as investigators uncovered more evidence. And then there was the gun. Just 2 days before Doris Brody was killed, Maya allegedly purchased a .380 handgun. A recent gun purchase is one thing, but what she allegedly called that gun would make the detail even more disturbing. A Mother's Day gift. Mother's Day was nowhere near October. Months separated the holiday from the date of the shooting. So why call it a Mother's Day gift? Was it a joke? Was it something said casually? Or was there a darker meaning behind those words? The gun purchased just 2 days earlier was allegedly the same weapon used in the shooting that killed Doris, a supposed gift that the intended recipient would never receive. And when police searched Maya after taking her into custody, investigators allegedly found additional .380 ammunition in her pockets, 3 unused rounds, along with several unidentified pills. The investigation was now moving beyond a simple question of who pulled the trigger. The evidence was beginning to tell a timeline. A gun purchased, a 911 call, police being summoned, screaming, and then a gunshot fired while officers were literally outside. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the investigation was still waiting to be discovered: the notes. Investigators allegedly found writings that appeared to reveal Maya's thoughts before the killing. And one note in particular would become especially significant. According to reports, it contained a statement along the lines of, "I'm going to kill your mom with your fingerprints on the gun." That sentence immediately creates a disturbing image. A written statement, a reference to killing someone's mother, and an apparent concern with fingerprints and the weapon. For investigators, evidence like that could potentially suggest planning. Could it suggest an attempt to frame someone else? Could it simply be the writing of someone in psychological distress? Those would become major questions surrounding Maya's state of mind. Because the writings were not limited to a single statement. Other notes reportedly referenced MKUltra, mind control, jumping timelines, an awakening, reality itself. At first glance, the writings appeared chaotic, disconnected, possibly the thoughts of someone experiencing paranoia or delusion. And later, Maya herself would reportedly speak about hearing voices and moving between different timelines. She would describe an awakening. She would suggest that something larger than herself was happening, that she was not necessarily in complete control of her own actions. And that is where this case becomes much more complicated, because strange behavior and bizarre beliefs do not automatically answer the question of criminal responsibility. A person can appear confused and still make deliberate choices. A person can experience mental illness and still plan a crime. And on the other hand, a person experiencing a genuine psychiatric crisis may behave in ways that make absolutely no sense to anyone around them. The question investigators faced was not simply whether Maya was behaving strangely. The question was whether the evidence suggested that she understood what she was doing. And according to prosecutors, several pieces of evidence suggested planning. Inside the house, investigators allegedly found a white plastic sheet folded on the couch. There were also pliers, tools, items that, taken individually, may not mean anything. But investigators do not always look at evidence individually. They look at the entire picture: a plastic sheet, tools, a recently purchased gun, notes discussing murder, a false 911 call, and a shooting that occurred while police were standing outside. Investigators allegedly believed the items could have been connected to an effort to conceal or dispose of a body. And suddenly the case looked less like one spontaneous act, at least according to the prosecution's theory. It looked like preparation, like a sequence, like decisions being made one after another. But while police examined the crime scene, another question was emerging. What had been happening inside this family long before October 19th? Because families do not always break in one dramatic moment. Sometimes the fracture begins years earlier. Doris Brody was 87 years old. At that stage of life, many people depend on family members for support. And Doris had allowed her daughter into her life and her home. The woman she may have hoped would protect her was now accused of taking her life. Family members reportedly described a history of serious problems surrounding Maya. Her own sister, who was already incarcerated in connection with a homicide case, reportedly described Maya as intelligent and manipulative, and spoke about long-term drug problems. Those descriptions are allegations and opinions from within a fractured family, and they do not independently prove what happened on the night of Doris's death. But they provide context for the environment surrounding the case. And then there was another name connected to Maya's past. Jesse Kelly, her former boyfriend. He died in 2024 after drowning. His death added another layer of tragedy to the history surrounding Maya. The strongest evidence in this case would remain focused on October 19th. The gun, the notes, the 911 call, the scene inside the house, and Maya's own statements. After her arrest, Maya reportedly spoke about hearing voices. She discussed timelines. She described an awakening. The words were unusual, and they appeared to support the idea that she might have been experiencing a serious mental disturbance. But investigators also had toxicology results. According to reports, there were no illegal street drugs detected in her system, only prescribed medication. That did not automatically mean there was no mental health crisis. But prosecutors believed the physical evidence pointed towards something more deliberate than a sudden, uncontrollable break from reality. And this is where the case would eventually move from the crime scene to the courtroom. What does premeditation actually look like? Alleged premeditation can be inferred from actions taken before the killing. The purchase of a weapon, preparation, statements, attempts to deceive, actions suggesting concealment. Prosecutors believe this case contains several of those elements. They allege that Maya purchased the gun shortly before the shooting. They pointed to the fake 911 call. They pointed to the notes. Perhaps one of the most unbelievable details in the entire case. Police were already there. The officers were outside the house. And still, according to the allegations, the gun was fired. That detail makes the case difficult to forget, because if someone wanted to avoid being caught, firing a gun while police officers were approaching the door would seem almost impossible to explain. Unless the person didn't know the police were there, unless the shooting was not planned for that exact moment, or unless something else was happening entirely. And those are exactly the kinds of questions a jury may one day have to consider. Was this a carefully planned murder that suddenly accelerated? They charged Maya Brody with first-degree murder involving premeditation. The case went before a grand jury, and the charge remained in place. As of the latest stage described in this story, the case was still ongoing. That means Maya Brody had been accused, but the legal process had not yet reached its final conclusion. And until a case is resolved in court, the allegations remain allegations that prosecutors must prove. But the accusation itself carries an extraordinary weight. So the most important question is not whether Maya looked calm. It is what the evidence can prove. And that evidence will be tested through the criminal justice system. But while lawyers debate evidence and intent, one fact cannot be argued away. Doris Brody is dead. An 87-year-old woman lost her life inside the place where she should have been safest. And the person accused of killing her was her daughter. Doris may have spent that night believing she was simply at home. She had no way of knowing that the next few hours would become the final hours of her life. And if prosecutors are correct about what happened, the ending had been moving toward her long before the gun was fired. That is the detail that makes this story so haunting. Not just the shooting, not just the weapon, but the possibility of preparation. The idea that while Doris was alive in the same house, someone may have already been building the story around her death. So what do you think? Was this a calculated murder that was later explained as a mental collapse? Or was Maya experiencing a genuine psychological break that happened to unfold alongside evidence prosecutors interpreted as planning? The fake 911 call, the recently purchased gun, the notes, the plastic sheet, the alleged preparation, and the gunshot fired while police were outside. What do those details say to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and if you made it this far, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you never miss another case.